Hi, it's Puppetized Digital, and I'm here to talk about pipelines, products, and platforms, progressive delivery, really the new automation. This year, 2020, has been so challenging for so many folks. And I think that a really good example of what we've been doing in terms of software delivery and rethinking things and getting ready to step up is frankly curbside delivery. As a retailer in 2019, that was a nice to have. Get to 2020 and suddenly it's absolutely imperative that your customers can come to you with curbside delivery, payments that are contactless, everything that is easy, smooth and buttery. But as a retailer, are you ready for that if you don't have your own software developers on staff? Because that's what it's about, developer velocity. That's the mantra that we've been talking about in this industry for some time, coalescing around that idea that the most important thing as a business is to be developing applications more quickly, giving developers what they need. And who are these developers? According to GitHub now, there are 50 million worldwide. That estimate may be a little bit high. GitHub double counts, there are frankly some people out there that are not professional developers that have GitHub accounts. But on the other hand, the usual estimate's around 25 million. Of course, there are many hobbyists. Things are growing fast, and even with a reasonable growth rate, we're going to see 100 million developers within just a few years. What are they doing, and how do we empower them? Why do I care? I'm Monk Chips, James Governor, co-founder of a company called RedMonk. So we're an industry analyst company, but what we do is track software developers, software delivery, practitioner-led technology adoption. CI/CD was somewhat of a practitioner-led phenomenon, and it's been the basis of everything good in software delivery. Modern software delivery absolutely relies on it. And I think that when we look at that, frankly, the change in mindset around testing and who does that, that's really critical to delivering those applications with that developer velocity. DevOps has also been a fundamental part of this revolution. So a new way of constituting your teams, bringing them together into cross-functional teams, smaller teams, bringing the operations and all the different folks together in order to solve the problems, because there will be problems when you build applications. One of the underlying technologies in the DevOps revolution is, of course, infrastructure as code. It's absolutely critical. Now, some people would say, oh no, anyone that says DevOps is a product is trying to sell you something. Maybe that they're actually a consultant trying to sell you some consulting, because the fact is it is the interplay of people, platforms, tools that defines culture change. It's a learning loop, and the tools matter. It is no accident that the term DevOps came from one of the founders of Puppet. So if you look at Andrew Clay Schaefer, it was pretty clear that whilst he was talking about describing a set of practices, the automation that was built to help with those practices helped everybody else to begin consume and adopt the sorts of approaches that we're talking about. One thing with DevOps, one thing with this developer velocity notion, I think sometimes from a Silicon Valley perspective, we get really obsessed with velocity. Everything's about velocity. But of course, testing, CI/CD, unit testing, all the kinds of testing you could do, integration testing, bring it all together. That's what gives us reliability. And enterprise organizations, they want velocity, but they also want reliability. And indeed, if we look in some geos, perhaps Japan, perhaps Germany, quality and reliability is more important in terms of the digital transformation and moving into modern software delivery methods than, in fact, velocity is. Now, what we want to think our enterprise looks like is it's buttery, it's a manufacturing process, everything is running smoothly, and that's great. That is what we are aiming for in software delivery. But of course, very often it's more like this. Suddenly you get some race conditions, you don't know what's going on, there are errors happening, perhaps the pipeline breaks, can we do a rollback? Stuff is really, really hard, and it's not getting any easier. So Jenkins, if we think about CI/CD, obviously it began with Hudson. Kazuki Kawaguchi took some of those ideas about doing your own testing and built a framework for that called Hudson. Then Jenkins. And so Jenkins has been fundamental to the adoption of pipelines throughout our industry. But even the CloudBees folks themselves have acknowledged that too often we've got a Halloween scenario, that actually what we're talking about is a Jenkinstein. It's fragile. Just because there are all those plugins, thousands of them, doesn't mean that you need to turn them all on. And organizations, it begins to be, in terms of software delivery, are we serving Jenkins or is Jenkins serving us? So it's become brittle, and that's a significant issue for software delivery in organizations globally. Okay, so we've done this testing. We've said, look, the developer has to take responsibility for some of their own test coverage. We're shifting testing left. That's great, but at the same time, we have to shift testing right. What do I mean by when I say shifting testing right? Well, if we think about Charity Majors, she's a brilliant, well, she's the founder of a company called Honeycomb. She's a brilliant evangelist for new ways of building technology. And the point that she makes is that, look, you will always find new bugs when you get into production. We used to have this idea that we could have a separate test environment that should look like production environment. But the simple fact is that there are so many factors that can go wrong in prod that everyone eventually is going to be testing and debugging in production. And I think that's shifting testing left. I'll talk a bit more about that. Now, Charity, because of this fact, we're going to be troubleshooting. There are going to be a range of unknowns. We don't know what's going to hit the system. We do want it to be well managed. We do want to do all of the testing discipline, but we need great troubleshooting tools. And increasingly, that is why the industry is coalescing around the notion of observability. So we have the new players, Honeycomb, like I've already mentioned. But also, if we look at the traditional APM vendors, they're all retooling for this as well. We're seeing acquisitions from the likes of Splunk, because logging wants to get on the act. Distributed tracing, logging, monitoring, they're all looking to this observability notion of how do I understand a system from its outputs, because we're going to have to understand a system in that way when it breaks, and I tell you, it will. So let's think about pipelines. I've said that these pipelines as we were using them are brittle. Too many plugins, perhaps we don't have the flexibility to make those changes that we want to make. And of course, as an industry, we love to innovate, and what's happened? We've seen new technologies to begin to address that. So the Jenkins folks themselves, they understand that. They've said, okay, we need Jenkins X. Spinnaker, a technology that came out of Netflix. We've seen a lot of organizations beginning to adopt that. Circle CI really gave us this notion of a slick, well-managed CI service. GitHub Actions is going to change the game for a lot of automations around pipelines. And then we've got from the CNCF world, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Argo and Flux. And the idea that we're going to have modern tools built for modern platforms that are going to give us that pipeline automation that we're going to need going forward. There's so much choice for developers today. It's a veritable cornucopia of delights. There's so much out there, but of course that can create problems. I've got all those databases, new databases all the time. I've got programming languages. I'm Rust curious. I want to use Go. I've had enough of Java. I want to use TypeScript. All those choices, and choices are great, but of course they come with an overhead. So one of the things we've seen in RedMonk, where we track programming language adoption, is there are these cool new things that developers like to try. It might be Kotlin for your Android development. Python now is absolutely crushing it. We see some still a bit of stability at the top. So really, the main programming languages that you're going to see in enterprises and web shops today are going to be Python, they're going to be JavaScript, and they're going to be Java still. Java still has a really, really strong presence, although recently Python overtook it in our rankings for the first time ever. Here's the thing, all of that complexity, all of those choices are great when you first make them, but they also lead to a cognitive overhead, and that's a challenge for developer experience. Developer experience really matters, and we've been thinking about how can we serve developers when they want to make all of these choices and yet still maintain a managed environment. Because all too often from an enterprise perspective, what they see when they see developers making all of their own choices is frankly a bit of a mess. They do want some stability and they do want some enterprise standards. Even organizations that are crushing it from a cloud native perspective, someone like Pinterest, they'll say, look, no, these are the environments that we want you to use. You can choose other environments, but you have to have a reason for doing so. One of the technologies that came along with the idea that actually we could be a bit more polyglot, we could have more runtimes, we could have the ability to develop on our laptop and hopefully deploy it more broadly, although I've also said shifting testing left is gonna shifting testing right is going to happen. Think of Docker. So someone like pulled together a lot of the developer workflows, responded to the way developers wanted to work, and came up with a technology that just exploded in terms of developers, microservices, and really this kind of test-driven development, leading with test, throwing things away all the time. Everything was immutable. Docker really responded to that need. But in terms of industrializing it, Kubernetes came along, and Kubernetes has won. So when we think about containers, when we think about container orchestration at scale, very, very clearly across the industry, whether you're looking at the founders of the project, who from Heptio, that have now been, originally at Google, then Heptio, now acquired by VMware, with the Tanzu platform. You've got Red Hat with OpenShift. You've got all of the cloud players, public cloud players, GKE, and so on. We've got Amazon, Google, and Microsoft all saying, look, we're supporting Kubernetes as well. It has very much become the platform for portability for enterprises that want to run some of their infrastructure. Now, frankly, we've over-rotated. We've got to the stage where we're saying, well, hey, you know what? We need a chief Kubernetes officer. We're talking to organizations and you ask them, why are you choosing Kubernetes? And they say, well, we need to do containers. So why do you need to do containers? We need to do microservices. Tell us more about that from a business perspective. And frankly, the conversation kind of doesn't go very far. It seems at the moment that a lot of big organizations are just adopting Kubernetes almost for its own sake. That worries me because IT in business should not be a science experiment, but frankly, the industry's always done that. We're going to see a lot of shaking out. Developers really want to live in just 3 environments. They want to live in GitHub, they want to live in Slack, and they want to live in Visual Studio Code. They've got their code editor, they've got their platform for chatting, and they've got the place where code lives, and they collaborate on code. The primacy of the pull request today. Social coding is so important to developers. That's what they want to see. They don't want to have to break flow by going into a third-party environment. They just want to work in those environments, and yet they also still want those choices that I've talked about. So what's an option? GitOps is an industry approach that's taking off at the moment. So basically it's about storing your desired state in Git. So Git becomes your repository for change. And you can do everything there. When you want to make an automation in the environment, you do it via a pull request. So it's how developers want to work. So it gives you that compliance. Kubernetes clusters are, in many respects, they contain a lot of the automation that we used to use third-party infrastructure as code platforms for. Now a lot of that is in Kubernetes itself. So why not use Git to set off the automation in a declarative sense that's happening in your Kubernetes clusters. And we see that in across the board, organizations are using GitOps, even in documentation. Autodesk now stores all of its documentation in Git, and when someone wants to change the documentation, again, it is done by a pull request. It's about closing that loop for developers and working how they want to work. Developers used to build monoliths. That was the primary approach. Build a monolith, move ahead with that. It is productive, build something that works, and worry about refactoring it later. But of course that refactoring has happened. And as an industry now, we move to much, much more complex microservices topologies. This is Uber's. But that does create a huge set of challenges. That's why we need this observability that I was talking about. That's why we need great troubleshooting tools. Because with microservices, frankly, what is the network view? Do you really understand the interdependencies of one service and another? And if one breaks, sometimes you don't know what other services it's going to affect. That creates all sorts of problems, where running IT becomes like a murder mystery. We don't want that murder mystery, but frankly, if we think about, okay, we are going to run microservices and some monolithic development as well, the pendulum swinging back that way a bit. Who are the organizations that really began to adopt these new architectures? They began to use the cloud. The cloud has been instrumental to the rise of open source. It has been instrumental to the rise of social coding. And we've been on this revolution since Amazon Web Services hit the scene. So we began with cloud and then started moving up the stack into an era of managed services. So Amazon took on more and more responsibility so that developers weren't having to deal with that complexity themselves. We started to think about auto-scaling. We started to think about, frankly, worrying about the reliability of a service may not in fact be my responsibility. It could be Amazon's or Google's or Microsoft's. Moving even further up the stack, Amazon said to itself, look, we're going to take this to the next level where the developer is frankly going to have a managed service that scales to zero. They're not going to have to worry about anything. They're going to build an app. They may not even have to pay for that application until it is actually used. This is taking pay-per-use to its natural conclusion, and a lot of developers have got very excited about this. Some enterprises, because they want to do six-factor, they want to do cloud native, but they don't want to have to invest heavily in Kubernetes. But also those hipsters that are at the bleeding edge, thinking about, I want to use AppSync, I want to use GraphQL, I want to live an API-driven life, and serverless with Lambda is one of the ways to do that. Now, we're at a bit of an inflection point, because whilst Lambda is fantastic, Amazon's done a great job with that, building an ecosystem of services. That ecosystem of services were all within Amazon itself. What if we wanted to use third-party services? What if we wanted to use Auth0 for identity, or something like Algolia for text search, or Cloudinary for image resizing? What does the world look like? We're going to compose services across multiple services, compose applications across multiple services. FaunaDB, I think, came up a great name for this, because increasingly what we're seeing is fat front-end clients using React, and then they're orchestrating these back-end services, and it's a bit of a back to the future client, sort of memories of fat clients and client server, and they've dubbed it client serverless. There are other terms for it, might be smokestack. We're going to see a lot more of this sort of approach. Fundamentally, though, I think the important thing here is the notion that development is increasingly event-driven. Something happens in one system, and it has to trigger an event in another. We've got these listener sort of architectures. It's a different way of thinking about application development, but that is increasingly where the industry is moving. Talking about where the industry is moving, one of the things I think about a lot is this kind of world of the cloud and the metaphor of Apple. If we think about all of the things that Apple has sort of swallowed with the smartphone, we used to have a calendar, a physical calendar on a desk. We used to carry maybe a camera. It was always like, oh, where is my camera? Car keys. All of these things. There are scads and scads of devices that are frankly being swallowed by phones. You don't need to have a wallet anymore. You make your payment with the phone. So as the phone, this very well designed, buttery experiences that make us more and more think, hey, I don't need all of these third-party tools and services. I can just rely on the tool and all of these applications. That becomes really interesting. And the cloud is doing that to our IT roles. If we think about, we used to have DBAs. Obviously, DBA is still a role in many organizations. But RedMonk was surprised, actually. We began to talk to financial services companies. And they said, actually, we're getting rid of all of our DBAs. If they can't retrain as data engineers, that's really not where the value lies. The database should be managed in the cloud. It should be much more self-service. And I think much like with the Apple device, the cloud begins to take those jobs to be done on behalf of operators, on behalf of practitioners, on behalf of developers, and they get taken into these higher level managed services. And that's the direction of travel for the industry as a whole. And there is a rise and a fall and a rise again of specialization. One of the things with this Kubernetes wave I talked about was that everybody needed to know everything. We had developers and they had to know the Helm charts. We talked about full stack developers. They had to know everything about the database. They had to know everything about the front end environment, programming in JavaScript. But that's not necessarily realistic. And certainly from an enterprise perspective, you can't afford to compete with Netflix on salaries for your developers and practitioners. You need specialists and specialist platforms that frankly enable you to keep your costs down and your stability up. That's where things like, as I mentioned, Tanzu and OpenShift come in. One of the things that we've seen with the reports that Puppet has been leading in terms of DevOps research is this notion of platform teams. We see that sophisticated organizations, platforms teams, platform engineering teams, automation strike forces, there's a new set of roles and responsibilities, and those are what we see in the organizations that are really crushing it digitally, that are doing digital transformation, that are responding to the needs of developers. That's where we're seeing really those future-facing organizations are constituting themselves with teams like that. Because of course, who is this? It indeed is and was Netflix. They've led this revolution in so many respects. But it's the entirety of the sort of the FANG, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and I'm putting Microsoft in there as well. Because the product teams are the engineering teams. The engineering leaders are the product leaders. And that's what we're seeing from organizations that get it, whether they be enterprises or whether indeed, as I say, they be those digital leaders that we look up to, and certainly look up to their extremely large share prices. So product management is engineering. Product management in many ways is a sort of product management in some ways has been like a product management discipline. We think about Jira and tickets and everything else. The smart orgs have really let engineering lead the way there. Let's think a bit about what does it mean to do experimentation? Because engineering should be like science. Product management should be like science. We need to be A/B testing everything we do before we roll it out. We need to have capabilities to do that. We can't just have the highest paid person in the room, the hippo, making product decisions. They're going to make mistakes. You really do want to be able to roll things out to your users and find out what they like. Experimentation, of course, is yet another culture change, but experimentation is how the most successful businesses are now running their IT estate in terms of applications and digital services. Because not everything that you do is going to work. There is a Cambrian explosion across the industry of tools and platforms. There is a Cambrian explosion of the things that you should try, but not everything is going to make it. And some things are going to just end up, frankly, as fossils. We don't need them. We're going to move on. Think about Google, and they've done this for the longest time. It used to be Google Labs in their email services and with Google Docs. More latterly, they brought that to Android. You sign up and you say, hey, I want to try all the cool stuff. I'm prepared to do alpha testing, pre-alpha testing. Not everybody wants that, but some do. So turn the services on, and then hey, look, Google is going to ask you, what do you think of the feature? And you can give them feedback in the app as you use it. And I think organizations are really thinking, hey, this approach that Google, I think, really led with the perpetual beta is something that is very, very relevant to us, although obviously from an enterprise perspective, don't necessarily want it to be a beta. We want to, be able to have a set of questions that we ask our users, and they may be internal users, they may be customers, they may be citizens, and we want to tie those into our pipelines in that way that I mentioned. So pipeline management is part of that, product management, part of the platforms that we really need to be tying together. Testing and production, super scary. When the enterprise hears this, in fact, even when they hear continuous delivery, they get scared. Because when they hear continuous delivery, that sounds really, really scary. It sounds like, frankly, the second before everything ceased to exist. I was talking to a guy called Sam Guckenheimer, recently retired from Microsoft Azure. He worked in Azure DevOps. And he talked to me about what they call the blast radius, that any new service they roll out, they should roll out to a specific set of customers before they roll it out more broadly. So how do they do that? They do it with sophisticated routing, using cloud-based technologies. Perhaps we're going to roll it out to our internal users first. Perhaps we'll roll it out to our Australian customers first. Perhaps we'll roll it out to Illinois first. Let's have some control, and let's control the blast radius. Deployment of a service does not mean release of the service. Marketing, frankly, should be the people that decide when we turn the release on. We decouple the two. And I call that progressive delivery. When you've got A/B testing, when you've got blue-green deployments, when you've got canaries, roll everything out to a tiny subset of customers before you roll it out more broadly. Think about rolling out a service to Tokyo when everyone's asleep from an infrastructure perspective so that you can make sure things don't break. Remember, shifting, testing, right. But have a really good handle, a really well-tested and validated system before you roll it out. And then you can be comfortable and you can be rolling out your applications on Friday afternoon without sweating it. Not everyone's going to be comfortable with that, but we should all be trying to get to a position where we could be comfortable doing that. And that's why I talk about progressive delivery. It's a term that came up and it's been interesting because developers like it, but I've also found that it feels like a lot of enterprises I've talked to, CIOs, feel a lot of comfort factor in the idea they're in control of when something gets rolled out and to which cohort. Companies like Nike are investing in feature flags. They've built their own engine for that, called Moray, because they know that they're going to be doing e-commerce at scale. They want those great experiences. And feature flags is one of the on-ramps, frankly, to progressive delivery. Capital One is an organization that uses a lot of Kubernetes. For them, they need to be able to think about, hang on, am I in a position to do a service rollback? They've again built their own open source technologies so that they're thinking to themselves, how do we manage services on these complex Kubernetes clusters? Because there's a lot of non-deterministic behaviors there. Again, feature flags as comfort factors. Finally, I want to talk about Target. I began with retail. I began this talk talking about retail. Target's super interesting because they used to be an organization that a lot in retail did a lot of outsourcing. So for them, it was we had 20% in-house and 80% external developers. They've in fact moved to 70%, it was 70% external and 30% internal. Now they're 80% internal and 20% external in terms of contractors. They do everything themselves because they need to be able to move with developer velocity. They serve those developers well, they think about their needs, and build technologies and practices accordingly. Because here we are, we're in an event-driven world. Pipelines is part of your modernization strategy. These are the new frontiers in terms of automation. Product management is a discipline that we all need to concern ourselves with. And in order to do that, we need to think about the developer experience because there is a developer experience gap. That is holding us back and preventing developer velocity. GitOps and observability can help us kind of bring this stuff together so that we have a control loop in terms of the applications and services that we deliver. We want to manage that risk. We need progressive delivery for that. We want experimentation, fast feedback loops. Bring it all together, and we want platforms that can begin to bring that automation together for us. And it's not just the old configuration as code, it is everything as code. So we're thinking about the developer experience gap. Stephen O'Grady, my business partner, did a great job of thinking about this in a recent blog post. And he said, look, it's going to be comprehensive. It's going to touch all of the environments. It's going to be touching the traditional virtualized environments. It's going to be touching on-prem. It's going to be touching all sorts of services. It's got to have a great developer experience. It's got to be elegant. So if we think about that Apple experience, far too seldom do enterprise vendors and projects really bring things together in a way that is elegant. Elegant makes jobs to be done easier. That drives adoption so much in modern IT. Those are the things we're looking for. You've got to cover and support all the runtimes. It's got to be multi-vendor. And I think when we think about all of those, there's a certain Swissness, there's a new way of thinking about it, and that's the new automation. And I think that's the sort of demand that we need to be thinking about for our technology providers like Puppet. So, that's Puppetize Digital 2020. Have a great day.